medical examiner got a call. Followers of Christ Church, so I knew what that meant.
There are so many cars here. Where do we even park?
The hallway in the house is shoulder to shoulder lined with people, and you squeeze your way through.
We're having people stare at us, and we have to figure out where we're supposed to go.
Which is a bedroom in the back of a house.
Where Ava was laying on a bed, deceased.
In the late 1800s, Pentecostalism swept across the United States. The Oregon-based Followers of Christ Church rose out of this movement. Its members believe in the literal interpretation of the scriptures and in a controversial ritual known as faith healing, meaning faith in God is stronger than conventional medicine. Because of that, scores of church members have died from very treatable illnesses. And on March 2nd, 2008, a 15-month-old baby girl named Ava Worthington died from a blood infection brought on by pneumonia. She wasn't the first child death, but she did yield the first prosecution of parents for neglect. Carl and Raylene Worthington, Ava's mom and dad, were charged with second-degree manslaughter and criminal mistreatment for refusing to seek medical attention for their daughter, even when they knew she was gravely ill.
Clackamas County has large rural areas, some of which are rather isolated. There are people in Clackamas County who have never been to Portland, even though it's a 20-minute drive. It votes considerably more conservative, deeper penetration of religion into the community.
The medical examiner responded to a child death. The lead detective, Michelle, and I responded.
We have to squeeze through people. There's just people everywhere. They're all the members of the Followers of Christ Church, their family, their friends, people that were brought in to pray, lay hands, support the family. We were led into a back room in the master bedroom where Ava was laying on a bed, deceased. When we look at this child has this huge mass on her neck. We obviously can recognize that this is not normal. Detective Rhodes and I, we believe that it fell in as a crime.
So Carl Worthington and his wife, Raylene, both were charged with manslaughter for allowing their daughter, Ava, to die of a blood infection that could have been corrected with common antibiotics.
I was born into the Followers of Christ Church in Oregon City, and that is the only way you can join. You have to be born into it. The Followers of Christ came to Oregon and Oregon City in the early 1930s from a Followers of Christ Church in Boise, Idaho. The leader, Walter White, didn't agree with what was happening in Idaho. Oregon at the time had more liberal laws about requiring medical care for kids, so he thought it was a good place to settle.
They believed that Walter White was a kind of prophet, somebody who was able to interpret the words in the Bible. Their interpretation of Christianity is very different from anyone else's that I know of. I think it's as close to being a cult without being a cult.
Their beliefs are that they don't turn to medicine, then instead rely on faith healing. Their versions of faith healing involve predominantly anointing with oil, the use of wine, and laying on of hands.
There's an actual passage in the book of James in the New Testament where it talks about if you are ill, seek out the elders to come and anoint you with oil, and then have them pray for you, and you will be healed.
There were many years of children dying in their group. I'd quietly buried them, barely reported the deaths the way they're supposed to.
Yes, there are numerous children that have died, some horrendous deaths.
Walking through that church's cemetery, I noticed a lot of children who have died since 1999. You remember that was the year Oregon passed a law making it a crime to ignore a child's critical illness or injury that leads to death.
What actually changed the law back in 1998 was a little boy by the name of Bo Phillips. He was 11 and he died a horrific death from diabetes. And that ultimately led to some changes in the laws.
When we're talking about Ava Worthington, who is a 15-month-old baby, my job is to advocate for her. She should have every opportunity to grow up to be an adult.
So the Worthington case was the first case that had come about since the new law back in 1999. And so there was a lot of people looking at this case as a precedent case going forward.
The trial wasn't a philosophical conversation. The trial was a criminal trial where the parents broke the law, and we were trying to hold them accountable. Members of the jury, on March 2nd, 2008, Ava Worthington died a needless death. She died a death that was preventable. She died a death that could have been stopped had her parents, as they are legally obligated to do, had provided adequate medical care. What you're going to hear is during the course of this trial is that absolutely no medical care was provided for this little girl. And you're going to hear that her medical condition was such that it was absolutely obvious that medical care should have been and could have been provided. You're also going to hear that the medical care that would have and could have been provided would have prevented her death.
Worthington was the first case that we brought in Clackamas County here in Oregon against members of the Followers of Christ Church. There had been a long history, well-chronicled history of children dying within the church, but previous administrations had opted not to bring criminal charges. It was a difficult but righteous decision.
Mr. and Mrs. Worthington are devoted, loving parents who would do anything for their children. The reason we're having this trial is Mr. Worthington, Mrs. Worthington absolutely deny that they caused the death of their child, Ava. Mr. and Mrs. Worthington did not deny medical treatment to their daughter. They never felt that it was needed.
I think this was a bit of bias. The prosecutor had run on a platform of get tough with the church.
This community is very devout, and they look to the King James Bible and a literal interpretation of it for guidance and direction in their life. And they were doing what the Bible tells them to do. What they did was working. Ava was getting better and on her way to complete recovery. That's what the Worthingtons thought, and that's what all the community thought, and all the family and the friends thought. And none of them foresaw the tragic end that took Ava Worthington's life.
Thing that was significant to me was a large growth on the right side of her neck. I had never seen anything like that in my experience.
When investigators arrived at the home of 15-month-old Ava Worthington on the night of March 2nd, 2008, they were shocked to find the condition of her body. What was worse? Her parents hadn't sought medical attention. They chose faith healing instead, fasting, anointing the child with oil, and laying hands on her while praying. Although there were well over 100 people in attendance at the time that Ava was dying, none of them called 911.
Were you on duty back on March 2nd of 2008?
Yes, I was.
And do you recall receiving a call that evening from a representative of the Followers of Christ Church about an infant death?
Yes, I did. He told me that the child was Ava Worthington and that she was approximately 15 months old, and that he had no idea, as to the cause or manner of her death.
They participate in faith healing by laying on of hands, which is putting their hands on someone that is ill. And it normally starts with the family, the immediate family first. As someone gets sicker, they will expand. They have a very extensive phone tree, so they will start calling people very quickly in their groups.
When I arrived on scene, there were many, many church members there. Most of the men that were present were gathered outside the home. And when I entered inside the home, there were many, many female church members, so much so that people were lining the hall. It was pretty much standing room only.
Normally on a crime scene for us, as we're trying to clear the residents, clear the location, and so this was a little bit different of an environment.
And I saw Ava lying on the bed. As I looked at her, the first thing that was significant to me was a large growth on the right side of her neck. It was an anomaly in comparison to other infant deaths that I have seen. I estimated it to be the approximate size of a baseball. And in my training and in my experience, I recognized that as being something that was going to be worthy of asking more questions about, probing questions as to what that large swelling might be. I had never seen anything like that in my experience, and so I knew enough that it was atypical.
I think people were shocked that a child would be, allowed to die in that capacity. Her injuries were serious. That size of a cyst on a child's neck would have a pretty dramatic impact on a child's ability to breathe.
Are there any other preliminary observations that you make while the representatives are still and the grandfathers are still in the room with you?
Yes, I see the other traditional things that I normally see in a home where a person of this church has passed away. There was a baby bottle on the TV tray that contained a red liquid. I did not test at the time nor afterwards as to what it was. My speculation is that it was wine, but I did not know for sure. I also saw a bottle of olive oil, which I know is customary for the church. They use that to pray for their infirmed members, and they use that to bless the persons with.
The ability of parents to practice their religion and do faith healing with children would receive some protection under the First Amendment, so long as it is not threatening of the life or the health of a child. Once, though, however, the parents enter into a situation where they should know, or they do know, the child needs medical attention, then they do not have a First Amendment claim any longer, at least against the state.
We had a very strong medical neglect case. The photographic evidence and the injuries that Ava Worthington suffered were severe and very visible through the evidence that we were able to offer at trial.
So I'm referring you to State's Exhibit number 23. Again, how is this helpful in your investigation?
For me, it depicts her hair is greasy in appearance, and she has a very shiny feature to her face, and I attribute that to the olive oil being applied in a manner of blessing.
Smaller Pentecostal groups actually believe they're going to heal people. So they actually do believe there is illness, but they do not necessarily believe that medicine is the way to affect that.
Mrs. Worthington's statements that the baby didn't appear to be in any great distress, didn't appear to have significant respiratory problems, was in rather stark contrast to her husband's explanation that he believed the baby was in respiratory distress, was having trouble breathing, was gagging. And so in my mind, there seemed to be conflict at that point in their statements.
No bushy-haired stranger came in the middle of the night and strangled her. She died because of this blood infection. Blood infection came from something that could have been easily taken care of with antibiotics.
You had a do-over, and you knew that a doctor's procedure using a syringe, for example, could have made a difference in Ava's comfort level or Ava's survival. Would that have changed your decision? It wouldn't have.
In 1999, the Oregon State Legislature changed the laws that had protected members of the Followers of Christ Church by allowing them religious exemptions. The death of 15-month-old Ava Worthington would be the first time that the Clackamas County DA's office decided to file charges against members of the church for medical neglect of their children. The thinking, a successful prosecution would set a precedent and send a very clear message to the community.
Did you and other members of your team make a decision about wanting to recontact both Mr. and Mrs. Worthington now that you had essentially the preliminary reports, although not the final report, from the autopsy.
Yes.
And so you had a better idea of what was really going on, at least to some degree, about what the child's condition was. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. And were there other areas then that you wanted to talk with the Worthingtons about as part of this investigation?
Yes, there were. We actually went with the state medical examiner to his office to look at her lungs and how much infection was in her lungs, which was so significant that we would expect parents to get treatment for that.
Did you consider taking Ava to a doctor? Do you have medical insurance? Does anybody in your family, you, your husband, or either of your children have medical insurance? Has Ava ever been to a doctor?
Although this was a religious case, we still looked at it like we would any child abuse case, from the scrutiny of what the DA's office, how they would be looking at it, as well as our agency.
You and I have talked, or three of us have talked, about some remedies or actions that you take when you think that someone is ill. Mm-hmm. And those include anointing with olive oil, right, praying, right, the laying on of hands, right, fasting, yes, and the use of wine, yes, drinking of wine. If you saw her condition becoming worse and worse, and you did those things, yet it continued to worsen, what was the next step to help save Ava?
People believed that if you're martyred, if you die for your faith, then you're going to heaven. If you're living your whole life in fear of hell, and your life is only like 70 years, if you're lucky, but eternity is eternity, and you think you're going to get punished in hell forever, like, perspective. So it does make sense, and I don't judge them.
Do you feel like adequate medical care was provided for Ava during this? And what do you consider to be adequate medical care in this situation? Did she receive any medical care?
I grew up believing that if I did anything wrong, I would go to hell. I thought if I went to a doctor, I would go to hell, and that every little thing can make you go to hell. I thought if we went to the doctor, took a vitamin, like, it would kill us anyway, because we heard all the horror stories of, like, people going to the doctor for something minor and dying. So I just thought doctors were bad people, and it meant you had weak faith, that you didn't trust God to heal you.
Whose decision then was it for her?
It's my decision.
Is it your wife's decision as well?
She can help on it, but ultimately I'm the head of the house, so it falls to me.
I was just naturally a bit of a feminist and didn't like the rules about women's places. The girls mostly got married by 17, boys by 18. And that was the goal, is to get married. If you stay a virgin, you get this amazing wedding. They furnish your house. So there's a lot of reward for following the rules.
If it were left to you, if your husband were indisposed, if your decisions would have been different. Is there anything more or even less that you would have done or different for Ava? If you had it to do over, and you knew that a doctor's procedure using a syringe, for example, could have made a difference in Ava's comfort level or Ava's survival, would that have changed your decision?
It wouldn't have, because what I was doing was working.
I believe that they knew that she was that ill. And what we base that belief on is that they brought in a lot of people to lay on hands, to be there. And as people get sicker and sicker, and before they pass away, more and more people come. They knew that she had the ability to pass away, that she could possibly die.
They say in the days leading up to Ava's death, there was a lot of prayer, but no doctors.
I prayed for like 4 days or something. It was weird.
In our law, it says that we must provide adequate medical care for children. Do you believe that you provided adequate medical care for Ava?
I do.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think would have helped?
I did everything I could for her.
Okay.
What medical care did she get?
I guess fine medical care. I did everything I believed to do to heal her.
The Worthingtons are some of the longstanding members of the church. I believe that they wanted to believe that what they were doing was making a difference. I think they're trying to protect themselves as part of the founding members, that they wanted to believe that they were so strong in their faith that God's will would be that Ava would not die.
Doctor, is this a death certificate that you signed?
It's not.
That's not coming in. Whether you agree with my interpretation of the rules of evidence or not, we're going to play by those rules.
To secure a conviction against Carl and Raylene Worthington, Clackamas County prosecutors would have to clearly demonstrate to the jury just how sick Ava was. The task? Proving that no reasonable parent could watch their child's health deteriorate to such a point over such a prolonged period and not suspect she needs medical attention. The defense, on the other hand, would need to argue that while Ava did have chronic health issues, she ultimately died of an acute infection that could not have been predicted.
Did you perform an autopsy on Ava Worthington on March 3rd of 2008?
I did.
There was intense media attention at the local level and at the national level. I mean, the case was televised on court TV. There were cameras in the courtroom. We were definitely operating under a microscope.
The child appeared cachectic, and by that I mean small for age. Also, I described the abdomen as being soft and flat. And in children this age, usually they're somewhat full. And then the other thing that's very apparent externally is that there is a 3-inch by 4-inch fleshy mass beneath the skin on the right side of the neck. I described the larynx and trachea and the esophagus as being firmly compressed between the mass and the overlying skin. So that's basically your Adam's apple, your airway, and your esophagus, which is where your food goes down to your stomach. Those structures were being firmly compressed upward and into the skin overlying her neck. So this is interfering not only with her breathing and the protection of her airways, but she's not getting sufficient nutrition. And that's also described with cystic hygromas because it's pressing on these vital structures.
Ava had a treatable condition. She had that large hygroma on her neck, eminently treatable, even in the last hours when it overwhelmed her system. In your opinion, was there adequate medical care provided to Ava Worthington?
Object. That's up to the jury to decide.
The objection is overruled.
In my opinion, there was no medical care given to Ava Worthington.
And had there been adequate medical care going all the way back to 3 months, even up into including just shortly before her death, would she have survived?
Yes.
We had great medical testimony. We made a very strong case that had the child, even late, had they gotten medical care, would have survived.
If a person has sepsis, and you stated that was from bacterial infection in the blood?
Correct.
Would you agree that that can take someone's life very rapidly?
It can, yes.
And in fact, would you agree that even if a person's in a hospital setting, if they contract sepsis or septicemia, go into septic shock, their life can be over, and there's frequently very little that can be done for them?
That's true.
These poor people did nothing wrong. They weren't liked. There was an agenda.
Some strains of pneumonia can cause death within a matter of hours. And you're aware that that has happened in Clackamas County?
I'm not aware of that.
Can you refer to that document and refresh your recollection?
Okay, well, let me Doctor, is this a death certificate that you signed?
It's not.
Okay. Mr. Knight, you're beyond the scope of the area that I authorized you to inquire into.
Okay. I felt we were dialed in on this argument. I was arguing that other children had died in this community rapidly.
The starting point here for some relevance to this seems to be lacking here fairly markedly. So, and I thought we had that clear.
Judge Maurer was never my favorite judge. He had a bit of a temper, I thought.
Unless you're going to call this doctor or attempt to call this doctor to opine about the relative aggressiveness of this particular pneumonia and make some connection again to this case, that's not coming in.
As I was standing there, and I was trying to say, but Judge, can I, I wanted to defend myself. It was very demoralizing.
Whether you agree with my interpretation of the rules of evidence or not, we're going to play by those rules. And I would say that it seems as though you were straying beyond the bounds of those rules. And so I don't want you to do it again.
Very well, Your Honor.
So I want to bring the jury back in, and then we'll go ahead and proceed.
I think the judge demonstrated some bias. Judge Maurer was, in my opinion, a difficult judge.
There's been a lot of talk about medicine, modern medicine, conventional medicine. What is your understanding of that?
It is always risky to put defendants on the stand, but in a case like this, it's hard not to. Carl and Raylene Worthington are not on trial for what they did, but rather for what they refused to do. They made a decision that cost Ava, their 15-month-old daughter, her life. It was a decision to put their faith in God rather than in medicine. It was also a decision that was supported by their family, their friends, and fellow members of the followers of Christ Church.
I want to ask you, first of all, some questions about your son, Brent Worthington. Has he ever been to a doctor, to your knowledge?
No, he hasn't.
And what about yourself? Have you ever been to a doctor?
No, I haven't.
And your husband, Guy Worthington?
He has not either.
And how's your health?
Very good. I'm very healthy.
This was not your average criminal case in any respect. In many respects, these people are normal people that you would see out in the community. And in many respects, they were law-abiding citizens. There was one glaring defect, and that happened when it came to medically neglecting their children.
And did you ever see her with a lump on her side of her neck?
Yes. It was just barely swelled out just a little.
And what did you think of that?
It made me think of my daughters. My daughter does similar things. Her gland will swell out also.
Have you had experience with that yourself?
I have also, when I was younger, had same side swelled out just a little bit.
Did you feel that this was a problem for Ava's health?
No, I didn't. I figured she was doing things similar to my daughter, and I had told my son and Raylene the same thing.
It didn't matter whether you thought she needed a doctor, because you would not have encouraged them to seek medical care, would you?
I wouldn't have.
Were you concerned that she was at risk of dying?
No, I never thought she was dying. She was doing so well just several minutes before that. And when we did lay on hands, she received relief. Her breathing was much better.
Well, even if that's true, it was fairly short-lived, wasn't it, Mr. Worthington? Unfortunately.
Yes, it was in this case.
There's been a lot of talk about medicine, modern medicine, conventional medicine. What is your understanding of that?
Well, I've heard a lot of people use the term excluding medicine, and I don't really think that is how I would describe it. I would describe it as just trying to live by faith and trying to rely on your faith.
Cross-examining Mrs. Worthington was a very difficult task as a prosecutor. She had lost a child. I really had to get to the truth of what those individuals saw. So we made a strategic decision to ask much more difficult, harder questions at the risk of alienating the jury.
So I want to make sure this is clear then, Mr. Worthington. The reason all these faith tenets were being exercised is because you recognized that her condition was worsening. Isn't that right?
Yeah, like I said, she wasn't feeling as well Saturday night as she had Saturday, so of course.
How strict is this about whether or not someone can go to a doctor?
Well, no one's excluded from the church or anything if they do that.
The fact that you did not get your daughter to a hospital Saturday night and she died a day later has not changed your position on whether or not you believe in and use personally for yourself, not talking about anyone else, the use of modern medicine.
No, it hasn't changed the way I feel. It's been, I've seen nothing here that's proved to me that it would have been any different had we have taken her in.
We believed that kids who died like this were going to heaven, and we didn't believe there was any other way for them to go to heaven because they couldn't be baptized. If you could get a time machine and you'll get baptized by Walter White, you're going to heaven. But you can't. And so this is the way they can go to heaven.
When they have a child who dies, that's a traumatic event to them. They believe that their faith was just not strong enough. They don't believe they should reject faith healing. They believe they need to actually buckle down and do a better job in their beliefs. When they are prosecuted, then they're going to feel like, once again, the world is against them. And this almost heightens their commitment.
And making a decision, an important decision within your life, how does that occur?
When it comes down to it, for major decisions, they are his to make.
Can you disobey your husband?
Well, I'm not supposed to if I am trying to live how I feel I should.
Okay. Do you disobey your husband?
No.
You said, why would you take a child into the doctor? And the answer to your question is that you take them in because they die from bacteria and pneumonia and swelling. Does that make sense?
I said, why would you take them in when they're doing better? And she was showing all signs of doing better to us. And I'm not convinced that the thing on her neck had anything to do with her passing.
Even
and
at this
I
point?
had no idea. I didn't know she had a pneumonia. I didn't know any of that.
And why was it that you didn't know that, Mr. Worthington?
I'm not a doctor, I guess.
Parents have legal obligations to provide for children's basic needs. That includes food, water, shelter, and medical care. When that medical care is neglected and it results in either a physical injury or results in a death, then a parent can be prosecuted.
Even if those chronic issues hadn't been addressed, it still wasn't too late. It wasn't too late. Saturday or Sunday or even close to the time of her death, it still wasn't too late.
Do you view this as a case of medical neglect?
No. Dr. Janice Ophoven was superb. A pediatric forensic pathologist. There aren't many of those in the world, and I think she's the best.
Just wanted to make it clear whether you view this as a case of medical neglect or not a case of.
No, this is a child who got sick and died in just a little bit over 24 hours. We haven't beat infectious disease. We're better at it than we were in the 40s, but kids get sick and die rapidly from infectious disease all the time. Most of those kids don't end up at the medical examiner's office.
So in a case like this, who is the real culprit?
Strep pneumoniae, the bacteria.
Our defense was the child had a cold, developed sepsis, and died quite rapidly. She was doing fine and fell off a cliff.
In the Worthington case, they presented a quick, fast-moving death that occurred with Ava. They introduced the concept of sepsis. Our expert found that there was no evidence of sepsis.
If you had heard Saturday night and early Sunday morning that the child wasn't breathing good, that they, meaning the women that were caring for her, had to keep her up to keep her breathing, and that the father thought that she might die, as a medical doctor, what would your medical advice have been to that family?
If indeed it was as that is described, I would recommend that they seek medical attention.
These were preventable and treatable illnesses. We put on a very strong medical neglect case.
And I don't care how heartened you are by your client's cause. This is absolutely improper, and I am stunned. I am literally stunned that you tried to pull this stunt.
In front of this jury, a whole host of medical experts with conflicting opinions. Did Ava die of neglect, or was her death unpreventable. It's up to the jury to wade through all of the science and decide if, in the end, medical intervention could have saved Ava's life.
Sepsis is a silent killer, and we believe that that's what took place here, and that there is no fault in not being able to recognize something like this, something that even trained medical personnel, the best equipped hospitals can't recognize and can't treat. I remember in my closing argument, we had prepared it meticulously. Dr. Young testified that kids die less than 3 weeks. A kid in Milwaukee, Oregon died less than 3 weeks before Ava died of pneumonia.
Objection, Your Honor. I've got a matter for the court.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll have you step out of the jury room for just a moment here.
Judge Maurer sent the jury out and gave me a lecture for, I think, close to an hour.
This is simply a blindingly stupid move on your part. Now, let me just say that you made an effort. You made an effort with Dr. Young to get into this area, which I clearly indicated on more than one occasion was not proper. You tried to get in the death certificate, and we had an extended discussion, much as we're having now, about the impropriety of that, and about how you were attempting to take something that was clearly inadmissible without any adequate foundation and place it improperly before the jury. You have tried cases for years. Where does this come from?
Your Honor, this comes from, it's on the record. The death certificate was excluded, but the information is before the jury.
Now, wait a minute. Let's just stop right there. This was not a situation where the document somehow was not admissible, but the information on the document was. This is not, no, now wait just a minute, Mr. Knighting, because this is treading on very dangerous ground. I must say that there is a certain amount of professional responsibility that adheres to each and every participant in this process. And I don't care how heartened you are by your client's cause. This is something that goes beyond simply the matter of advocacy. This goes to the heart of our profession. And I must say this is absolutely improper, and I am stunned. I am literally stunned that you tried to pull this stunt.
It was a devastating lecture. You know, I've never been reprimanded or sanctioned by the bar. That tongue lashing always has stuck with me.
The 2 hours was never testified to. I made specifically clear that absolutely was not going to come in.
I think the lecture he gave me during my closing argument actually helped, because the jury in the jury room back there, a couple of the members contacted us after the trial and said, what the heck was going on there? They could hear him yelling and screaming all the way back in the jury room.
If you go there again, I'm going to find you in contempt of court. So let's be clear on that. Let's just understand that there are boundaries here.
I'm very clear on that, Your Honor. And I apologize to the court if you thought I was trying to do an end run, but I thought that this witness had testified to it, and I thought I had, it was fair game.
And finally, when the judge settled down, he just said, don't do it again. Bring the jury back in.
Well, it was a very intense trial. Mr. and Mrs. Worthington had lost their child, and now they were being prosecuted for causing that child's death. And that's not an average criminal case that you prosecute. That is a unique set of circumstances. And so it was up to the community and up to the jurors to hold them responsible.
Any reasonable parent, once they become aware of a swelling in an area as sensitive as a person's neck, the bells go off. They let their child die. They were not willing to compromise their religious beliefs. They were not willing to show the weakness in their faith that it would have required to get medical help for that little girl. The law is clear. The law says when there's a conflict between religious expression and the welfare of children comes first.
It was an emotionally draining case for all of us, and the jury too. They didn't take this thing lightly at all. They were very involved in this case.
After you have reached your verdict, you should signal the bailiff that you have reached a verdict, and the court will then be reassembled to receive that verdict.
We tried very hard to be respectful of other people's religious beliefs. But on the other hand, there is the render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, render unto God that which is God's. In this case, their belief system put them in direct conflict with the laws of the land.
In the matter of the State of Oregon versus Carl Worthington, find the defendant as to count 1 not guilty of the charge of manslaughter in the second degree as filed in the indictment. Find the defendant as to count 2 guilty of the charge of criminal mistreatment in the second degree as filed in the indictment. In the matter of the State of Oregon plaintiff versus Raylene Worthington defendant, find the defendant as to count 1 not guilty of the charge of manslaughter in the second degree as filed in the indictment. Find the defendant as to count 2 not guilty of the charge of criminal mistreatment in the second degree as filed in the indictment.
They convicted Mr. Worthington of criminal mistreatment in the second degree, a misdemeanor, acquitted him on the criminally negligent homicide, and they acquitted Mrs. Worthington of all charges.
Our clients are not celebrating a victory. They lost their child, and that's something that's going to be a cause of sadness for the rest of their lives.
It's not cut and dry by any means. There's so many things that come into it, and the manslaughter was, the word itself is not a pretty word, I guess. It's hard to correlate that with this situation.
I interviewed the jury foreman. I mean, why didn't you convict on manslaughter? And she told me, well, they didn't do it on purpose. I think she misinterpreted the law, frankly. I'm not a lawyer, but in Oregon law, manslaughter is an accidental death that you had a responsibility to prevent.
I remember one juror who said, you know, when they send you home with your newborn baby, there's no instruction manual that comes along with it. It's all a learning process.
God provides, and he has provided doctors and dentists, and you can go to the dentist, you can go to the eye doctor. Some people, will go for other things. They can get braces, but they wouldn't do something that they know would save their child.
Officially, they don't take their kids to the doctor still. I've talked to enough people off the record who say they do go to the doctor and they do take their kids to the doctor. They just don't tell people they do. But I believe that there are core families that are not.
Oregon has clearly drawn a line as a result of these cases by virtue of repealing 2 sets of laws within a relatively short period of time. Oregon has made a very clear statement that protection of children is important, and that regardless of your faith, you do not have a right to necessarily impose that faith upon your children in making these very important decisions about life and death.
Medical treatment does save lives. Medicine's a good thing.
Although Carl and Raylene Worthington were acquitted of the top charge, second-degree manslaughter, the Clackamas County DA sent a clear message to the members of the followers of Christ Church. Religious beliefs do not outweigh the safety of their children. But sadly, it was a message they would need to send again when just 3 months later, in this same family, Raylene Worthington's teenaged brother died under similar circumstances. Now Raylene's parents, Ava's grandparents, would face criminally negligent homicide for the death of their son, Neil Begley, Ava's uncle. I'm Ashley Banfield. Thanks for watching.